In terms of the resistance training, it was used in terms of our research program. We did use a Kaiser system, so we did focus a lot on proper form, so there was a lot of motor learning involved. So as you can see, all the movements are fairly slow and controlled. It's not about lifting as much weights as you can and quickly releasing them and banging them, clanking them, as you might hear in the gym if you do go to the gym and hear people working out. Again, emphasis is on proper form, but as well, hold on, I'm just going to show one thing. We also did do a lot of exercises without machines. And the reason I do want to show this is because I want to show you how adaptable, per se, resistance training can be. So here we actually do bridging to try to strengthen the glutes. Okay, so for this individual, she was just on her back and we're trying to work out the glutes and the hams. And you could always increase weights by putting some hand weights or sort of sandbags on top of the thigh. For those individuals who are able, they actually went on a body ball, and what they would have to do is actually push up. I don't know if she'll do. They would have to, yeah, so push up and then push out. So it's much more advanced, but again, you can always modify. And the reason, again, I want to show this is that you can tailor exercises to your individual capacity. Okay, all right. So that was the resistance training that we did, so both with machines and without. And what do we find? So what we did find was that after 12 months of training, that the twice and once a week resistance training actually improved executive function. So even once a week resistance training was beneficial. And using functional MRI, we actually showed that for the twice a week resistance training group, there was significant benefit in terms of how the brain functions. So again, much more efficient in performing the task at hand. And this may not be as relevant to all of you, but I also want to flag that we looked at how much people, or how often people went to see their doctors within the 12-month trial. So we actually got them to document if they went to see an eye doctor, if they went to see their GP, if they went to see any specialist, if they had any change in medication. And the reason we did this because we wanted to see if you were on an exercise program such as resistance training, could you actually reduce the amount of healthcare resources you utilize during this time? And we actually showed that for both twice a week and once a week resistance training, you can actually reduce healthcare dollars within that period of time as compared with the balance and tone group. And again, this was fairly significant findings and actually had received some attention from the Parliament. And funny enough, very few studies actually has ever done this type of analysis looking at what is the benefit to the healthcare system in terms of dollar when we're talking about exercise. And yet I think all of us intuitively would recognize that regular physical activity probably would reduce healthcare resource over time. Okay. And then we also did another study in 2012 that really looked at, in a very similar fashion, how does resistance training promote cognition among now those individuals who are at greater risk for developing dementia, so people with mild cognitive impairment. And just very briefly, this trial was smaller. We only included 86 individuals, and they were also a bit older, so 70 to 80 years old. And in particular, these individuals did have measurable deficits in their cognition. They also had complaints themselves. So if you ask them, have you noticed any changes in their cognition? They would say, yes, I've really noticed lately I haven't been able to remember things as well or be able to make decisions as well. But at the same time, not formally diagnosed with dementia. And very similar to our past study, we actually did find that with resistance training, after 6 months only, we could improve executive functions. And what's more interesting to me, anyways, as a researcher, is that the magnitude of benefit that we observed in this particular group actually was greater than the healthy study group. And we actually observed the benefit within 6 months as compared with 12 months. Furthermore, we found that resistance training was able to improve memory, and specifically what we call associative memory. So associative memory is your ability to tie two pieces of information together. So it's very similar to my husband often comes home and be like, oh, Teresa, remember you told me this information? And very often I would have to correct him because he might have remembered the information right, but it wasn't from me. He doesn't remember the source of the information. It might have been his best friend, and I was there during the conversation, but it wasn't me who actually provided him with the information. And the ability to connect the two appropriately is called associative memory. And the reason why we looked at this specifically within our study is that your associative memory actually can change as early as in your 40s, my age. So very sensitive to aging, and also changes quite a bit in the early AD stages. And so within the lab, what people had to do is they would see different faces. So they might see this face, and then they might have to look at a different scenery. So first it'll be like, can you remember this face? The second time would be, can you remember this scenery? Then the third condition would be, do you recall seeing this face in relation to the background? And trust me, it's a really, really hard task. I tried it and I failed miserably, miserably. But interestingly enough, again, we actually saw significant improvement in the resistance training group. Now in this particular trial, we actually also included a aerobic training group as well. So it's actually one of the first studies to really look at both types of training in one study. And we actually did find that aerobic training also had benefits, not surprisingly, based on past studies as well. And so here what we found specifically is that people were able to remember a list of 15 words. After 6 months of aerobic training, they were able to retain that list of words quite well even after being distracted. So basically you were given a list of 15 words, you were asked to try to remember as hard as you can. Then we would be really mean and say, okay, here's a new list of words, try to remember these list of words. They would try really, really hard and be like, okay, what were the words in the first list? And people always give us this look like, really? Anyways, so it's what we call recall after some type of distraction. And aerobic training actually did improve it. And as you can see from this bar graph, and I won't go into details, with the resistance training, there was trends for improvement as well, but we just couldn't find it in terms of statistical significance. Okay, so in summary, moderate physical activity is beneficial for cognitive function, even among those at greater risk for dementia. And as you may recognize, for many of these older adults, they weren't physically active prior to starting in the study. So really what we're also showing, starting to exercise in late life is not futile, even for those who are sedentary previously, can improve their cognitive function. In terms of how does physical activity improve cognition, it seems to induce changes in both brain structure, function, and also increasing growth factors, and also potentially regulating your insulin response. Now, other pathways that we are really interested in include sleep. So there is a lot of talk about if you are physically active, you sleep better, and that potentially is neuroprotective, mental wellness, and self-efficacy. So for the last bit, I just really want to talk about two studies very briefly that really hopefully will sort of bring home the key messages I'm really trying to give today. So the first one is, what are the long-term consequences of regular physical activity? So in some ways, I did address this already in the first study I talked about, whereby if you walked twice around a standard track in 15 minutes, you would have some neuroprotection. Well, we now have studies with much more advanced neuroimaging that's really giving us more insight as to how does that neuroprotection occur. So for this particular study, which was done in Pittsburgh, it's a cohort study. So individuals were recruited back in 1989. And basically at baseline, or in 1989, they asked people, how many city blocks do you walk per week? Okay. So that was your index of how physically active someone was. And I recognize there's limitations to that, because I'm sure if someone asked me that, I'd probably inclined to boost up my numbers just a tad. And probably many of you would as well. But interestingly, what they found 9 years later, that those who walk greater distances actually had greater brain volume. So they were able to retain their brain matter much more so if they were walking greater distances back in 1989. And as well, the greater amount of brain matter was related to reduced risk of cognitive impairment. Not surprising at all. But let's talk about what is the minimum dose. So what these investigators looked at is, well, what was the threshold that you had to walk to have this neuroprotection whereby you could actually maintain your brain volume? And they calculated to be at least 72 city blocks per week. So I recognize 72 city blocks seems like a heck of a lot, but I broke it down for you. I Googled and looked at what is the average distance or length of a city block. Is approximately 80 to 100 meters, depending on the city you live in. But in Vancouver is approximately 100 meters. So without going to the math, 72 city blocks actually equates to just over 1 kilometer a day. And 1 kilometer may still seem rather daunting, so I'm going to break it down even more. So 1 kilometer per day actually is approximately just over 2.5 laps around a standard track, right? Which actually really concurs with that, again, the first cohort study I talked about. 1 kilometer is equivalent to approximately 10 city blocks. Or if we're talking about time commitment, for an average older adult who has a gait speed or how fast they walk of 1.35 meters per second, this is sort of the average speed of an older adult, is approximately a 13-minute walk. For an older adult who's more frail, who may have some, significant healthcare conditions, and using a lower gait speed, so they're walking slower, we're talking about 26-minute walk. And again, my point is, these are, again, hopefully what you perceive as manageable doses. We're not talking about, 90 minutes or even 60 minutes. And the second component I really want to address is that if you've been sedentary all your life, is it too late to start? And the long and short of it is, it's never too late to start, really. So back in 2010, Laura Middleton published a paper including approximately 9,000 women, again a cohort study. And basically what she found is that those who were physically inactive as teenagers but became active in later life had lower risk than those who remained inactive. So and then there's subsequent analyses, but the main message was, it's just better to start at some point than to never start at all. So again, overall summary, regular physical activity is sufficient for maintaining brain health. And again, moderate levels of this activity is never too late to start. And I know I'm reiterating this over and over again, but these are key points and often very much key questions I get. So I just want to emphasize the literature really does support that you still can reap benefits even if you have been sedentary prior to. And as well, if you look at the overall literature on physical activity, I think it's safe to say that it is really a legitimate medical therapy, not just for dementia, but pretty much for all chronic conditions, okay? And I also want to emphasize in terms of the benefits we have observed in terms of exercise on cognition, the benefit exceeds what has been reported for drug trials. So there's been a lot of drug trials done looking at different agents to treat or to prevent dementia. And overall, the effects across those studies are lower than what we are observing in our exercise trials. And I think that's really, really important. But the last point is, I also recognize, and I think all of us recognize, that generally a sedentary lifestyle is becoming more prevalent, and that really physical activity is underutilized, okay? But I would also encourage all of you who are here, who obviously are very interested in healthy aging, that you yourself could be advocates. We know concretely that individuals respond to their support group, to their peer group, to who they associate themselves with. If you become the advocate for your friend, for your family member, that is definitely one step ahead than just really thinking, well, it's really difficult to start. It is difficult to start, but you can make a difference. And for anyone here who may be a physician, we concretely know you have a huge role in the promotion of physical activity. Individuals listen to their doctors. So for all physicians, if there are any in this room, even anyone in the healthcare system, do ensure that physical activity promotion is part of your discussion with those who you treat or interact with. And lastly, I do believe physical activity is the key to both quantity and quality of life. And so what I tried to do today is really to present, things that I can measure and quantify. But there's a lot that I observed that I can't quantify, but I can only share with you through pictures. And what I can attest, so within our trials, sometimes we do really good things, sometimes we're not so good in our management, but overall, I would argue that for those who have been in our different studies, really have enjoyed the experience. And I don't think it's necessarily us. I think it really is the experience of adopting a behavior that they know themselves that is good for them. They do end up creating a new network of support that they didn't have previously. So I know for a fact that for some of our participants who were in our past trials that finished in 2008, a core of them still actually meet for coffee once a month or once every 2 months. And so it really is quite an enriching experience. So I really do encourage all of you to really consider the adoption of this activity. And again, if you are already an adopter, then try to be an advocator. Otherwise, I just want to recognize my lab and our collaborators and our funding sources. Sorry, the slides are going on. So that's it.